Hi, it's Charlie McCarran. This is one of my very rough uh, recordings intended in my mind for the first year novice class. And uh, now I'm doing it right after my 2 Sunday services. Again, take what's of value for you. I know that in our upcoming class, we're going to be sharing about who is Francis of Assisi. So I thought I would take the fact that Francis has been seen through many lenses over the years. And as the writer of the new source book, those editors have divided the Franciscan sources into three really lenses of looking at St. Francis: as a saint, as a founder, and as a prophet. I've taken those three titles as the outline for this. So it's probably going to be too long. I know I talk a lot. So for you to just sit and watch, you can watch it in these three almost standalone sections. All right. So here we go. In Franciscan studies, one of the questions that came in was popular in the 70s and that when I started was called the Franciscan question. Who was St. Francis? What did he really say? What did he really write? What do we really know about him? Who was he? Who was he in his culture? And he's always been, we can talk about the Francis of faith almost, and the Francis of history, the way we talk about Jesus when we talk about Christology. You could almost say the same thing about Francis. Who is Francis for people in their faith? Who was Francis historically? And they're two different, but not mutually exclusive questions. Who was Francis? And as he became more famous and more people identified him, many lenses were added to him. This is maybe the oldest picture we have of St. Francis. It comes from his, he lived from 1182 to 1226, and that this painting was probably done at some point during his lifetime, maybe from memory. But since, like the San Damiano cross, it's an Italo-Byzantine painting, and one that therefore isn't that interested in being a human likeness like a regular icon, right? Icons aren't meant to be exact portraits. They're meant to bring us to that person beyond their superficial appearance. So it's somewhat standard faith. So I don't know if we can get a lot from this in terms of what Francis really looked like. But this is at the very beginning of people thinking about Francis. We know that the location of this painting, which is the cave at Mount Subiaco, where Saint Benedict went to live as a hermit before he wrote his rule and before he really set out on that monastic life, which he is famous for. He went to this cave on Mount Subiaco to pray and commune with God. And it is one of the pilgrimage sites that we know Francis went to. We know he went to the apostle's tomb at St. Peter's in Rome, right? We know that one of his favorite pilgrimage places is the cave of St. Michael at Gargano, where there was to have been an apparition of the Archangel Michael, who was Francis's favorite saint. Remember, he went to Laverna for the fast of St. Michael, which is the feast of St. Michael was 29th. That's why he was up there around September 17th. So we know he went to the cave at Gargano. We went to the Apostles' Tomb, but he also went to the cave where Benedict had his conversion experience, to pray in the cave of St. Benedict. And most scholars think this painting is actually not a devotional painting, but a painting recording his visit by someone who might have been there, or at least was commissioned by one of the Benedictine monks who is there. And the reason we say that is, if you look at his hand that's visible in this detail, what's missing? The stigmata. There's no stigmata. What's missing around here? A halo. There's no halo. And what's different in the title? Remember, the last thing you write on an icon or a Byzantine-style painting is the name of the figure. Here, it doesn't say SCTS or Sanctus or ST. It says FR with the abbreviation mark, which means Frater Franciscus, Brother Francis, not Saint Francis. So for all these reasons, we think this is the earliest picture of Saint Francis, before he was known popularly or treated as Saint Francis. So one of the first tasks that the early Franciscans wanted to do, the first lens they wanted to look at Francis through, was Francis then as a saint. And to convince people, maybe to use modern terms, to market Francis as a saint. And that'll be the first lens we look at, Francis the saint. Sometimes it's helpful to look at another tradition when we're looking at these artistic sources to help us understand the different ways, especially Francis is treated. And the one that I have come across in my travels that is most resembles the treatment of Francis in art is Jizo, who is a Buddhist saint, especially popular in Japan. Jizo was a monk who became known as the protector of children and of lost souls. But like Francis, besides his stature as a Buddhist holy person, he also is very popularly and devotionally loved in a very informal way in Japanese culture. And so you have a majestic picture of Jizo like this. But we also have this picture of Jizo in someone's garden, showing that because of his state of calm and peace, it didn't matter to Jizo whether it rained or it shined. He knew God was caring for him either way. But you see the difference between these two depictions of the same person. And even more, as he became the patron of children who died in stillbirth or who died very young. In Western Christian tradition, you have that old Roman Catholic belief of limbo. What happens to a baby who doesn't get baptized? He ends up in limbo, which of course they have happily jettisoned. But in Buddhism, they also wondered, how do children, little infants who die, find their way to God? And because of his calmness, Jizo, holding in his hand his monk's staff with rings, would bang his staff to make the ringing noise so that all the children who have died and may be lost finding their way to God would come to Jizo and he would bring them to God. So he became associated as the patron of little children, especially children who might have died young or been stillborn. And so here he is again in one of these very informal images, which shows the great love and familiarity and comfortability people in Japan have with this figure of Jizo. And it became the custom when a baby died or when a baby was stillborn, that you would go to the temple and place a little stone statue of Jizo in that baby's memory as a prayer that the baby will find his way. And it becomes a place for the parents to go and visit and honor the child in honoring Jizo in this way. So that's what all these little images of Jizo are. And often what people do, this is a picture I actually took in Japan, one of my Japanese trips at a temple, is that they will bring these Jizo, stone Jizo, but also dress them in baby clothes or kids' clothes. And they've become a way for women in modern Japan to ritualize abortion. If a woman feels she has to have abortion, it's looked on as something very sad. And so they bring one of these Jizo statues to the shrine, and they will dress the Jizo to honor the unborn child. So this is showing that while Jizo is a figure of great majesty and honor and sanctity, there's also in his devotion a sense in people in Japan of a close familiarity and a comfortableness and a lack of formality about their connection to the figure of Jizo. So we see the same thing with Francis, right? This is a figure of Francis in Glory by Sifetta. And if we go to the lower Church of Assisi, you'll see Giotto in the roof or the ceiling over the altar in the lower church. You see Giotto's Francis in Glory, where he's dressed in a magnificent brocade and jeweled dalmatic as a deacon, seated on a throne, surrounded by angels. And certainly as a figure in our Western spiritual tradition, not just our own Franciscan tradition, but beyond, he is a figure of great power and stature and sanctity. But like Jizo, he's also a figure that by his nature, people are very comfortable with, right? So though we will find magnificent statues and paintings of Francis like this, we'll also find very simple things like this collage of Francis with the birds. And of course, Bird Bath Francis, which has become kind of a put down for a very kind of shallow, frothy view of Francis. Bird Bath Francis, the Francis of the Bird Bath, that people who maybe have very little formal Christian faith or connection, the one spiritual thing they might have is Francis on their bird bath. Or this, Teddy Bear Francis. So we're going to look at some great works of art, but we have to remember that Francis is one of those figures that the lens can be very dear, very intimate, can become almost too cute or too saccharine. And so it's one of the aspects when we look at the lenses of Francis. We do have to deal with the reality and think about in people's lives, what does Bird Bath Francis mean, or Teddy Bear Francis? But we're not going to look at that today. Just a question. Also, our own lens that we look at Francis and the Franciscan tradition can color, and we have to be aware of our own lens, how we're looking at Francis. So this is a reliquary that you will find in the Cloisters Museum, in the Treasury section it's called, in the Medieval Museum in New York. It's important to us because of what it says to us about our Franciscan theology or spirituality, because this was given by a Franciscan to a Franciscan house. It is obviously focused on the Virgin and Child, but it's also scenes from, we could say, the infancy narratives. So there's the Annunciation and the Visitation, the Nativity, the Annunciation to the shepherds, the coming of the wise men, and the flight into Egypt in the end. So it lets us know the importance of the mystery of the Incarnation in our spirituality. However, more jarring maybe to some of our notions that we might be carrying into what we think Franciscan things look like is who had it made and where it went. This was created by Elizabeth of Hungary. Elizabeth of Hungary paid for this golden reliquary, and she gave it to the convent of the Poor Clares that had been founded by Agnes of Prague, whom Clare writes her letters to. So it not just tells us something about Franciscan theology and focus on the Incarnation, it also says that while our early heritage certainly aimed for simplicity and poverty and simple things, we know that when it came to sacred space and formerly sacred objects, they would create something like this. And we know from the early lives, there's a story of Francis meeting a poor woman who needed food, and he went to the friar's oratory and took golden rings from the altarpiece to sell, to give to the woman. So on the one hand, he's selling some of it to give to the poor, but on the other hand, they had an altarpiece with golden rings on it. So again, some of our sense of how it was, we might bring to some of our view of Francis and who he was and how he acted, right? Sometimes it can jar us when we actually see things like this. Elizabeth of Hungary, gift to the poor Clare. This is just a close-up of the reliquary. We don't know what those relics would have been. Knowing the craziness of the Middle Ages, it might have been part of the veil of the Virgin Mary or her hair, or who knows. I imagine it's something associated with the Virgin Mary. There's no record of what it was. Not the other side. And you see also it's a nursing Mary. So a very, despite the angels and the crown, a very human depiction. That's Elizabeth of Hungary and her love for the poor, which seems to contrast with the gift she gave to the poor Clare. The other thing we have to be careful of is the overlaying. Again, this is another way that we can politicize or use our own vision of Franciscanism to color how we view things. Now, this is a painting of the martyrs of Japan that I was blessed to go to Nagasaki and visit the place where they were martyred and the shrine and museum that's there. And this is a painting of the Japanese martyrs, Peter Baptist and his companion. What you will notice, as you notice in this painting, even to a crazy degree, is the politicization of some Franciscan art by various parties within the Franciscan movement. So these saints are wearing the habit of the observant friars, where we, their descendants, even though it really didn't get organized into what we call the OFMs until 1898. But they were around in the 1500s and the 1400s, 1600s, 1700s. So these are dressed as what would become the observant habit. Were they observant? Some of them might have been. The other habit of interest to us to notice are these habited people. And in the back, all of these, many of the Franciscan martyrs were tertiaries. And this is the tertiary habit, what tertiaries wore. And in our province, what tertiaries wore, a form of this until, I guess, the 1960s, which is the tunic without a hood. Maybe in this case with a collar. When I knew them, when I was a young brother, the tertiary habits were with like a stand-up collar, which we call. These have regular collars, almost like what our CSFF sisters wear, right? That's the habit of a tertiary. The hood was a sign that you're living in community under the three vows. So tertiaries who lived together in community had a hood and vows, but secular tertiaries like us, like our current practice, would have worn these habits. These were tertiary habits. So these are all third order people. But the other thing I want to mention, so there's a certain political statement in the way the martyrs are dressed, right? And we'll see that. I'll maybe make note of it as we look at others. But what I really want to show is our tendency to Franciscanize things is up here. Saint Joseph and the child Jesus. Here's the zoom in. Baby Jesus was also an observant friar. Did you know that? That's like the old joke. Do you know that when we look at third order history, sometimes it seems we want everybody to be a third order member, Christopher Columbus and Dante and all these people. And they might have been. Columbus looks like he might have been. But the old joke is that St. Joseph and Mary were members of the third order. So, of course, that's not true. And baby Jesus was not an observant friar or any kind of friar. But our tendency is also a tendency to ascribe things Franciscan to things that aren't Franciscan. And we have to be careful of that as well. Just a little humorous example, but one you'll see, right? And so this image of Francis, which always has spoken to me of the mystery, shadowy, kind of in and out figure of who this Francis is. In these couple of simple lenses I've shared. Now we'll go as kind of an intro. Now we'll go to the first of our major lenses, Francis as a saint. Now we're going to have a big thunderstorm here. So I can't see my keyboard anymore. So I have to turn on the light. That's better. Now, I don't know if I'll edit this out because it's showing very real reality that these things are happening. So, Francis the Saint. This is an ancient English panel in a church which was whitewashed and so survived the diligent attempts of some of our Anglican ancestors to wipe out all the earlier art in the churches. And this is a bishop saint who's unidentified, but it's obvious it's Francis. And Francis, in typical Francis pose, where he's showing the stigmata, which is very different. We know that in his life, in the early lives, they tell us that he did everything he possibly could to hide the wounds of the stigmata. And most people, and they really weren't seen until after he died by most people. And they even invited a nobleman when he was lying on, his body was on the pallet, to come up and put his fingers in Francis's side to prove and attest to the fact that they were really there. And you'll see that in the pictures around the death of Francis. But because this was one of the great selling points, that Francis was a saint, a lot of the early, and this one wouldn't be too early, this is probably a 14th century painting in England, they will display his stigmata as proof that he was a saint and worthy of devotion. Here's this young man giving away his wealth to the poor. Now, we would think, and it's by Sasetta, who we saw that big painting of Francis in glory, we would think this is a picture of Assisi and Francis giving away the money that he took selling Giovanni Bernardone's cloth, Pietro Bernardone's cloth, I'm sorry. But instead, this is a picture of Anthony of Egypt. After he heard the gospel, and went through his conversion experience. He sold his goods and gave the money to the poor in his town. And this is actually a picture of Antony of Egypt, which is important because Antony of Egypt was one of the most popular saints in the Middle Ages. And the life of Antony of Egypt, written by St. Athanasius, was actually what we would call a bestseller in the early Middle Ages. Everybody knew, everybody who could read, or everybody had heard through paintings like this, the life and the story of Antony of Egypt. So if somebody saw this, they would say, oh, it's Antony of Egypt giving his money away. So that when Thomas of Celano writes his first life of Francis, 2 years or so after Francis dies, he modeled the life of Francis on the life of Antony of Egypt and uses Athanasius's life of the Antony of Egypt as the structure for his life of Francis of Assisi. So that when people would read his biography of the life of Francis, just by the structure, having been so familiar with Antony of Egypt's life, they would say on some level, oh, this is the life of a saint. Francis must be a saint. So we see that certainly in First Celano and some of the early writings, that some of the images that are used are repeated in different lives of saints because people recognize them, that this is what a saint does, and so this must be a saint. Here we have a picture of the death of St. Augustine by Gazzoli. And it has a lot of the standard images. So Augustine has died. His friars, who were mendicants, the hermits of St. Augustine, are gathered around him. And up in the sky, you see up here the soul of Augustine being taken into heaven. And so people who maybe had no idea of St. Augustine would have known this is the death of a saint and the mourning of a saint, because so Augustine is a saint, which of course Augustine at this point had been a saint for almost 1,000 years, so there wasn't any news. But Francis, who had only been made a saint or considered a saint in their lifetime, again, like the life of Antony of Egypt, who he will be associated with, we'll see always associations between Francis and Antony of Egypt. The same thing visually happened. So this is the death of St. Augustine. This is the death of St. Francis. Here is Francis, the soul of Francis, going up to heaven. Here's Francis's friars gathered around the dead Francis. So somebody who was used to this visual vocabulary, in coming upon this painting, would have said, oh, this person was a saint. Now, what's different, obviously, you don't see anybody kneeling up next to Augustine's body, the dead Augustine. But here you see this nobleman, which is the one I mentioned, putting his side in Francis's side. And you also see one of the friars kissing Francis's hand, kissing Francis's feet, because again, here are those marks of the stigmata to prove he is a saint. Here is just a brief, I could have found tons of paintings associating the Saint Francis with St. Anthony of Egypt. This is St. Anthony of Egypt. Because especially in later on, about maybe the time, this is a manuscript miniature from the early 1400s. At that period, and we'll see that later on, Francis was seen as a saint, but became recognized as a certain type of saint, a saint related to the Desert Fathers. And so Francis's credibility as a saint, he was often paired with either St. Anthony of Egypt, like this picture, or with St. Jerome, who was also considered a desert father, a saint of the desert. And those are the two saints, besides our own saints, that Francis is most commonly paired with, because Francis was not just seen or became recognized as a saint, but as a particular kind of saint. So in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, Francis was seen through the lens of the Desert Fathers. This is Berlingueri's panel in Assisi, and we will find these panels of Francis, the early portraits of Francis, when the move was, this man was a saint. So in this case, we see the stigmata again is prominent, and unlike that, also unlike the portrait in Subiaco, we see the halo. But also, in this illiterate age, we have almost a billboard of Francis's life. Here he is preaching to the birds. Here's Greccio. Here's the approver of the rule. And it's all about teaching that Francis is a saint. He wasn't just another great preacher. He was something special and worthy of veneration. Here's the scene of Greccio from that billboard style painting. Here's Francis preaching to the birds in that billboard style painting. Here's another simpler example of the billboard for Francis. Here we have the stigmata again. The cross is usually the sign of the founder of an order, and the book could be the gospel or it could be the rules. Now, what is different about this billboard, which drives the reality that Francis was a saint home even clearer, is that none of these scenes, unlike the prior one, where this is a scene from the life of Francis, right? This also seen from the life of Francis. If we go down here, on the lower edge, what you start seeing down here are not scenes from the life of Francis, but stories of miracles that happened at Francis's tomb or in other ways after Francis had died. Again, Francis is a saint. So what happens in this billboard is that none of these are scenes from the life of Francis. They're all depictions of miracles that happened most often, and 3 of them, at the tomb of Francis. This healing of the leg that was amputated didn't happen at the tomb. And they are miracles that you can read about in the cause of canonization that were given as proof, again, that Francis was a saint in his canonization. So the obvious message of this billboard picture of Francis is he is really a saint because look what he did after he died. He's working miracles. And again, this is very early. This would be maybe late 13th century, maybe 50 years, 30 years after Francis died. Also, the connection with Francis then in scenes of salvation history. So Francis is depicted as having direct contact in a mystical way with Mary, the child Jesus, which is another proof of his sanctity, that he kind of crossed boundaries. Here by Giotto, it's crucifixion. And down here is Francis. And here is Anthony of Padua, 2 of our saints. And probably this is the friar who got the money for the painting. But again, Francis inserted, because of his sanctity, into events of salvation history. Here's another one. Here is Francis again at the foot of the cross. Here are probably the people who paid for it. And by her dress and his cords, they might have been tertiaries. And of course, Francis at Bethlehem, Francis at Greccio. Here's Francis in the Nativity. This time, again, political, he's depicted as a part of the Capuchin reform movement. Here again, the crucifixion, linking it to Francis, and who's receiving the stigmata, the wounds of Christ. And over here, someone we don't really pay much attention to, but who was with Anthony, the most popular, well-loved Franciscan saint of the time, who was a prince of France, not Louis that we think of, but this is Louis of Anjou, who gave up his princely throne, became a friar minor, became a bishop, and probably with Anthony of Padua is the Franciscan saint who's depicted most often besides Francis. But devotion or knowledge of Louis of Anjou in our contemporary Franciscan culture is just non-existent now. And here again, Francis interacting with Christ, Child, and Mary. A later painting in the observant tradition. So they're wearing observant habits. And one of the great what's called one of the pillars of the observant movement, Saint Bernardine of Siena. Now, Bernardine of Siena was a very recognizable figure, and I think we have a death mask of him, and people really knew what Bernardine looked like, and this is what he looked like. So you can always spot Bernardine, even though there's no other attributes or things to give a clue. You know it's Bernardine just by his face. Here is St. Mary Major, the ancient basilica in Rome. We'll look at another one of these basilicas. We'll look at St. John Lateran, the mother of all churches. When we had the first Franciscan Pope, Nicholas IV, who was a conventual Franciscan, we would call him, Nicholas IV redid the mosaics in St. John Lateran and this, the Church of St. Mary Major, or the Great Church of St. Mary, which is dedicated to Mary. So the central mosaic is the coronation of Mary with John the Baptist and I think Luke, the person who paid for the mosaic. And here on the end, Francis. So Nicholas IV, being a good Franciscan, made sure Francis was placed here at one of the major churches of Christendom. Again, because he deserves to be here, because he belongs here, because he's a saint. And of course, all the depictions of what's considered his greatest mystical experience and miracle, the reception of stigmata. So there's many, many depictions of receiving the stigmata. And again, to look at some of this, this is probably a conventual depiction. He's wearing a conventional habit, which is what the friars here in America first wore. This is an observant habit for an observant house. So they're wearing the observant movement habit. And this is the habit of the Capuchin reform. So this was probably done for a Capuchin house, right? Here is a very early depiction of the stigmata. Now, the Capuchins, when they, of course, reform movements always want to go back. So the Capuchins looked at these first pictures of Francis and saw basically that there is a big medieval hood and nothing on the shoulders, right? So the Capuchins said, well, that's the original way Francis looks. So that's the way our habit looks. So that's why Capuchin habit doesn't have anything on the shoulders. A little aside. Here is another depiction by El Greco. Again, an observant habit. An observant habit. But they all have the same elements. This actually is probably a conventual. Of Brother Leo off, not really witnessing it, being away because Leo wasn't there, and Francis having the vision of the Seraph. This is a very unique one that I when I was doing the thing on motherhood and the wings as kind of a feminine thing. This is a colonial Spanish, colonial wood carving of Francis receiving the stigmata. And this artist, as far as I know, uniquely depicted the reception of the stigmata in this very kind of beautiful, intimate way as Christ embracing Francis with his wings. So, Francis is a saint. Now, besides what we've said about the concern of our movement to say he is a saint, the question that we're not answering, and this is, well, what does that mean? To say someone is a saint in the way of Francis. What does it mean? What does it mean for us? So the next section is Francis as the founder of an order, of a, we don't like the word, an institution, way of life. Again, as we saw in the earlier pictures of Francis, that the institution really split into different ways of living out the Franciscan charism. And so maybe one of the signs of our Anglican vocation is that our community hasn't split along these lines, and we allow people to pursue, as our principles say, prayer, work, and study should be in everybody's life, but everybody's going to have a different emphasis. So in the Franciscan movement, different parts of the order would have a different emphasis on study, on active ministry or work, on prayer and contemplation. So we would say, now these are really broad brushstrokes, that the conventuals, like this brother is a conventual, would have emphasized community life and community prayer and maybe study. The observant would emphasize preaching and active work in that way. The conventuals would have, with study, would have really had schools and education. So most of our great teachers, like Duns Scotus and Bonaventure and William of Ockham, would have been what we would have called conventual friars. The observants were more into preaching and going through the towns and preaching. The Capuchin reform, like many of their reforms, were grounded in return to more of the early life of the hermitages and preaching combined with preaching, so contemplation and that. So these three ways are those emphases on prayer, work, and study, besides also disagreeing about poverty. There are also lifestyle disagreements. And so the order has had a checkered history with probably more divisions than any other spiritual movement in the church. Okay, this is St. John Lateran, which I had mentioned. Here, Nicholas IV, our first Franciscan Pope, redid John Lateran, and the mosaic here is focused on the cross as the fount of new life, and Christ in glory surmounted by the seraph, right? Surrounded by seraphim. And here we have the apostles, the Virgin Mary, John the Baptist, what's called in the Byzantine Church the deesis. So usually on an icon screen in a Byzantine church, you'll see these two flanking Christ. But because Nicholas was having this done, now down here, I should say, are all the other apostles. Up here are the major apostles like Peter and Paul. But so up here, again, part of the fact that he's a saint, but also a founder. Over here is Francis. Over here is Anthony of Padua. So in the mother church of all churches, St. John Lateran, the papal church at that time, the church where the Pope lived, where Francis came to visit and to get the rule approved and all those things, Nicholas IV, probably as a Franciscan, felt Francis should be up there. But there's more interesting stuff here for us when we reflect on the movement that he founded. Oh, that's a close-up. So we have the presence of the Seraph in heaven with God, Christ. But here, I must have close-ups, I guess. Here we have St. Anthony, Sanctus Antonius. So that's Anthony of Padua. And on the other side, as I said, this is Francis. And being, though he was a Franciscan, he was a Pope. So right here is Nicholas IV, who had it done with Mary on his crown. So he might have been a Franciscan, but he wasn't maybe as humble as we'd have liked him to be. He also is the one who will approve a rule for tertiaries, the rule of Nicholas IV in 1289. He'll be the one who approves tertiary rule. But in the lower register, below these really great saints, in this line, there are two little figures, and they are both Franciscan. Unfortunately, as hard as I looked, I couldn't find, I could only find this one. I couldn't find this one, which is a shame because this one I couldn't find is brother, I can't remember his name. He was a tertiary who was skilled in architecture and art, and who therefore was assistant to the chief architect who did all the reconstruction, who we see here, James of Camerino, brother James of Camerino. And we see him with his plan, we see him with his square and his tool. And James of Camerino was a friar minor. The other Franciscan was a tertiary, who's depicted on the other side. And James of Camerino was a well-known architect and designer. And so by 1289, the order founded by Francis has architects. We know from some of the records around Assisi and Umbria that a number of the bridges were constructed using Franciscan architects and engineers, we would have called. So again, the order is already shifting and changing and growing in ways Francis, as founder, maybe could never have imagined. And so we get these depictions of Francis as the founder of this order. And here is a later depiction, maybe from the 1600s, of Francis, again, at that moment of the stigmata, his most famous, greatest moment, with the branches of the order represented. Here in his red cardinal is Bonaventure. This is Bernardine of Siena. Here is Louis of Anjou. Here is Louis of France, King Louis. Back here is Christopher Columbus. I think this is probably Pascal. And over here, holding her monstrance, is Clare and another Clare. This is John of Capistrano. And I'm going to guess that this is Leonard of Port Morris. So this definitely, those are the big figures in the observant movement. So the point of it is the depiction of the order gathered around the founder, the father. This is another depiction of the order, another observant depiction of the order with the various saints that followed. Again, here is a depiction that's actually, I think, in a missionary church in India of the Francis as Jesse. You know, when we the tree of Jesse that often we see. I know in my cathedral there's a beautiful rose window that depicts the tree of Jesse. Often we have Jesse laying on the ground, and springing from him as the root is this tree with all the figures and the ancestors of Jesus, culminating in the top in Jesus and Mary, the birth of Christ. Here, Francis takes the place of Jesse as the one who has given birth to this new tree in the church. And here you can see Louis, and it's hard to make out in this one. This is Clare. So the many branches of the order growing from Francis. And this is I took this picture, so it's not very good. This is a 6-foot high engraving from the 1800s that's in the basement of the library at St. Bonaventure, which is a Franciscan family tree of all the notable Franciscans in all the branches of the order: third order, first order, second order, Capuchins, conventuals, observants, various kinds of Poor Clares. They tried to put them all on here as it stood in the 1800s. And here is Francis and the first companions and the Portiuncula. And at the start of it all has grown from him in his founding into this great tree. This is a late Roman mirror, I think. I think it's the back of a mirror, which might be at the Metropolitan in New York, showing the emperor giving the laws. So this was a recognizable symbol in Roman art, classical art, of the emperor as the lawgiver, the one who gives the laws. So this image of the emperor giving the laws was adapted by the early Christians to be a figure of Christ giving the law. So this is an ancient Christian sarcophagus giving the laws to Peter and Paul and the apostles, giving the new law. Here it is again, in a Byzantine baldacchino over an altar. Jesus, like the emperor, giving the laws, the gospel and the Christian way of life. Here again is Jesus giving the laws. This is, I don't know that this is the actual date of this. It could be in the style, 1200. An ivory, probably from the cover of a gospel book, giving Peter the keys and giving Paul the scriptures, a depiction of Jesus as the lawgiver. And so we will begin getting images like this of Francis giving the law, giving the rules. In this particular case, giving the rules to the friars minor on one side and to the poor clares on the other side. Now, there are others. I should have put one up where he's giving the rules, the law, to the three branches, the friars minor, the poor clares, and the regular and secular tertiaries. Those tertiaries who living in community and those tertiaries who lived on their own. Francis the lawgiver. So one of the earliest lenses of Francis as the founder, as the one who gives us the pattern, the law, the rule, is his association with the lawgiver par excellence, who was Moses. In the letter ascribed to Brother Elias when Francis died, announcing the death of Francis, but also describing the stigmata and letting everybody know about the stigmata, which might have been written by Elias, might not have been written by Elias, but it comes from that early period. Francis will be called the new Moses, who led his people through the desert to the promised land and gave them the new law. And so Francis will be linked from early days as founder as Moses. This is a painting of Moses before the burning bush. We'll return to this later on. At a certain point, the burning bush becomes associated with Mary. So the bush was on fire, but never burned. Mary gave birth to Jesus, but remained a virgin. So Mary becomes associated with the burning bush. So it becomes relatively common to depict Mary in the midst of the burning bush. And that the God who speaks from the burning bush is the God who will become incarnate in Jesus. So this will become a common way. So, and also this is Moses who is tending the sheep of his father-in-law. He's taking off his shoes because he's been told it's holy ground. And this will become a very common image of Moses, and people will be very familiar with this image of Moses, and with, like the vocabulary of Athanasius's Life of Anthony. So they'll recognize that as a biography of a saint. This also, the vocabulary of this picture of Moses will become a known vocabulary to people. Francis and the burning bush with Mary and the Christ child. Here in the very Franciscan style, though, of the Immaculate Conception. And this will become the most common depiction of this burning bush image, often with Francis instead of Moses. So again, a link between Moses and Francis. As Moses was the giver of the law, Francis, as founder of this Franciscan movement, was the giver of this way of life. So what does it mean for us? You know, the same as Francis saying, what does it mean to say Francis is our founder, especially as tertiary? What does it mean when we look to Francis as our founder? The last motif that the editors of the new source books use is Francis the prophet. From very early on, Francis will take on mystical meaning, just as he took on some of the medieval qualities of a saint in people's mind, the working of miracles, but his experience of the stigmata and his prayer and other things that were associated with his life will link Francis to the Old Testament prophets who worked miracles. And we'll end with this look at some of the motifs of the more mystical lens of looking at Francis. Definitely not the Francis of history, but more the Francis in people's faith of who he was and in our own encounters with Francis in our lives. So Francis the mystic is, as I said, one of his is seen as this contemplative desert father, which is understandable since all the places, remember they weren't called priories or monasteries, they were just called places. All the early places of the Franciscans, of the friars minor, were hermitages, usually pretty remote. So that's why the connection will eventually be made between Francis and the Desert Fathers, but Francis and the Desert Prophets, like Moses, who was a person of the desert, like Elijah, like Ezekiel, will be seen as being connected to this kind of desert spirituality and mysticism. The time alone in prayer. This actually is one of the few early 19th century Anglican pictures of Francis. You can usually tell that it's an Anglican picture of Francis because for some reason, Anglican images of Francis tend not to have the beard. I don't know if Anglicans, English patrons of this art thought it was very messy or uncivilized for him to have a beard, but he rarely has a beard in 19th century English art depicting him, which I don't know, is kind of interesting, would be an interesting little study. So this is Francis in prayer being serenaded by an angel as he was off for one of his times of solitary prayer. Francis in prayer, maybe after the reception of the stigmata, being comforted by an angel, Caravaggio. Done for, well, we know it was done for, but again, for a Capuchin house, because he's wearing a Capuchin habit. And Capuchins, because of their attraction to prayer and a more contemplative style, like the Recollects, who are another movement, tend to use this prophetic lens for Francis more, which is what they inherited as the inheritors of the tradition of the spiritual and the early friars. So they will emphasize the mystical kind of prophetic Francis quite a bit. Here's another image of Francis being comforted by the angel in his mystical experience. Another one you will see often the skull, not just in Francis, but in other saints, a reminder of death, that he would be meditating on the skull to remind himself of death. Here again, Francis in this patched old Capuchin habit, embracing Christ crucified, which you can see in my office. Murillo did the very famous painting of it, but it was a common way of expressing Francis's attraction and love for the crucified. And a type also. You'll see similar images for Bernard of Clairvaux. So it's a way of talking about Francis's mystical experience of the crucified in his prayer. The marriage of Lady Poverty. So these three figures, it comes from a story in one of the early lives. They encountered these three women on the road, and here we have celibacy, the white one, obedience, the red one, and poverty, the one in Franciscan grayish brown. And he's placing a ring on Poverty's finger, and they disappear in the life. Here they're flying back to heaven now that he's married to Lady Poverty. So again, it's a way of talking about him having these mystical experiences. Here's another depiction of that story in the life of Francis encountering for the personified three vows in three women he encounters on a road. Another example of this his prophetic sense. Also, he does these prophetic actions. If he breaks a fast, he'll wear like a chicken leg around his neck and walk around the town. If he wore warm cloak or one maybe, and he encounters a poor person who's got a thinner coat than him, or he will take lambs. Or when he gets older and sicker after the stigmata, and they want to put lamb's wool on his habit to keep him warmer, he says, sew it on the outside so people will know what a sinner Francis is. Or when he walks into the friar's house, the place in the hermitage, and he thinks they're having too extravagant a meal, he'll go out, put on a beggar's hat and coat, and come in and sit on the floor and pour ashes on his head. Or the converse, he'll come in the house at Christmas and smear meat on it. So he would do these prophetic actions, like many of the prophets, to startle and to teach. Here we have an old engraving of the fiery chariot which took Elijah up into heaven, right? And so one of the and here's another depiction of Elijah going to heaven in the fiery chariot. And we have in the early lives the story of Francis, that the friars see Francis in a fiery chariot being taken into heaven. And this is the depiction of that story, which is also in one of the chapters of Bonaventure's life, of Francis in the fiery chariot. So an obvious connection to Elijah. This is really the last image we're going to look at. And we're only going to look at it briefly. It's one of my favorite images because it is loaded with all kinds of images of Francis and all kinds of lenses that the early movement looked. And we're just going to look at two really major identities. So it's called St. Francis in the Desert by Giovanni Bellini. And he did it for a Franciscan hermitage that became a big monastery on an island in the lagoon at Venice. So it's one of the little islands off of Venice. And the whole island is this Franciscan place, which by the time of this painting has become a big monastery and a place where reform movements will often go to practice greater prayer. And the name of the island, the monastery, is St. Francis in the Desert, because stories told we know Francis liked to go to islands in the middle of the lakes. In the middle of Lake Trasimene, I got to go to an island, which is one of the ones he went to be alone and to pray. And apparently the story is that on this island in Venice, he would stay on the island so he could be alone. And it became a Franciscan place and a now monastery called St. Francis in the Desert. So again, the link. So Bellini painted a picture of Francis in the desert. So Francis is shown out in the wilderness at one of these hermitages, caves that the friar stayed in. And for a long time, art historians have struggled over just what is this a picture of. In some ways, his stance resembles all those images we have of his reception of the stigmata. And the landscape, the rocks in the background, actually look like Laverna. So some have argued, well, maybe it's a mystical reception of the stigmata. There's no seraph. Some have tried to argue that there was a seraph, but at some point they cut the seraph out of the picture. But usually when there's a seraph, there's also the rays. So some say maybe it's a mystical depiction of the reception of the stigmata. But as people have studied and tried to get into the theology of the picture, it turns out it has a lot of meaning connected to Franciscan theology. And some of these lenses we've looked at, even one more kind of shocking in a way, or one that we have of him than one we've looked at. So I'm just going to look at those two images from this painting, which has, so St. Francis in the Desert is now in New York in the Frick Museum. It's one of my favorite spiritual things to do. If I'm in the city, one of those rare times I go into New York City, is I'll go and I'll pay a visit to this painting and just pray for a while. So, what do we have here? So we have Francis outside of the city, like all the early Franciscan houses were, kind of in this remote, wild, wilderness, desert place. We see the cave, the hermitage, and him standing. But what is it? What are the images of this? Is it just a nice landscape with Francis standing in it because he loves nature? No. One of the things that's noticed is the shadow in the painting and the lighting of the painting. So Francis is lit from the front. See his shadow? And his shadow is really different from the shadows on the landscape. Behind him are not as prominent. He's also painted in much brighter tones than the landscape. If we look at the tree, this very strange tree he's looking at, he's focused on, as we said, there's no stigmata, and most people, I don't buy that there was not a stigmata, a seraph. I don't buy that there was a seraph and somehow it got cut out. I don't think so. But this strange bending tree. Remember, the people who looked at these pictures had a vocabulary, that they knew the vocabulary of the images. So here is an early picture of something we had seen, Moses coming to the burning bush. So here's Moses with his sheep, and then Moses approaching the burning bush, taking his sandals off. And here's the burning bush, as it is often depicted in many early paintings, that it is inflamed, but it is also bent, kind of with the weight of God's presence. In this case, depicted by an angel. A tree which is bent over. There it is again. So we have here the tree that's bent over. Over here, in the Hermitage, we see Francis is barefoot. Not because he doesn't have sandals, but because he has taken his sandals off. And so he is barefoot. And here, in the Hermitage, are his sandals, which he has removed. Now, as another aside, we know what branch of the friars lived in St. Francis in the desert, what kind of observance. They were called Zoccolanti. Zoccolanti were clogs. And so those friars wore clogs. We know this was done for Zoccolanti house, which Francis in the desert was. So we have Francis before a bush bent. He's taken off his sandals like Moses. And in pictures, here you see that bent tree again with the presence of God as it was imagined. And here you see the conflation. Here's Moses taking off his sandal. And here, you can barely see it, is the prior. So this is Moses, the flock, but out here is Moses tending the flock before he sees the burning bush and comes off in curiosity, takes off his sandals, and then encounters God, which medieval paintings will often do. They'll kind of conflate a story in one image. Here, we have Francis in that same kind of pose, that we see Moses in with the extended hands. He has taken off his sandals, as we saw, and the tree is bending under the presence of God. And here is the shepherd tending his sheep, like we get in the typical Moses painting. And as a final clincher, I guess we could say, there's a close-up of the shepherd. Is this image, which is next to Francis, which is a fountain, water, coming from the rock. Another Moses image. So one of the images then and lenses we've seen is Christ as Moses. But in this case, the more prophetic, mystical Francis, it's not Moses the lawgiver, but Moses who encounters the presence of the I Am in the burning bush. So Francis before the presence of God, like Moses before the burning bush. So it's not so much a depiction of a fact in Francis's life as it is a telling of who Francis is for us, or was. Someone who encountered the living God, who we are seeking to share in that encounter, or to learn from what he gained in that encounter in his prayer. We're going to look at another identification that's in this painting, which, well, maybe we'll look at one more thing that people allude to. So, if we look at the figure of Francis, we see this square. Now, at first, you look at it and you'll say, oh, it's one of those passages in the habit where, we saw another picture of Francis with a very patched habit embracing the crucified Christ. This is just a patch, but it isn't. If you look at this white object stuck in his cord, you see, look at the shadow of his habit. This is not sewn onto his habit. This is something which he has stuck in his cord, a piece of paper or a piece of parchment that he has stuck in his cord. The greatest autograph we have of Francis, of course, is the blessing to Brother Leo, who this group of Reformed Franciscans, Zocolanti, would certainly been aware of, because Leo was one of the heroes of the spiritual and more Reformed movements, right? So they certainly would have known. And Leo's letter, parchment is on display, and it's very beautiful when Francis addresses Leo as his mother. And also on the back is where we find his blessing, what we call the blessing of St. Francis, the Aaronic blessing, as in Aaron. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord show his face to you. Written on the back of the letter. And Leo treasured that and kept it in his habit for his whole life, which is why we have it. So it's really the only autograph we have of St. Francis. And here it is. This is the back of the letter, which has the blessing, which he has signed with the tau. And all kinds of speculation about what this thing is that Francis was trying to draw. Obviously, he was no great artist. Is it a skull? Is this a head? Is this Mount Sebastian? Is this Calvary? Who knows? But what's clear, it's almost like Alexander Hamilton's signature on the Declaration of Independence, right? That big signature. No, I'm sorry, not Alexander Hamilton. John Hancock. To sign your John Hancock. So Francis was very obvious with his signature. And so he wrote Tau. And so some art scholars, and it makes sense to me, that the only little square of parchment or a letter that we know or have or would have been, everybody would have known about, would have been the letter to Brother Leo, marked with the tau. And so one of the figures the painting identifies Francis with, in this prophetic sense, was the tau rider at the end of the world. Now, in Francis's day, the tau had primarily been a sign, here we go again, of Anthony of Egypt. And so the other name for a tau cross is St. Anthony's cross. And there was an order that was very big, the Hospitallers of St. Anthony. And here is a picture of St. Anthony depicted in their habit, which had the cross of St. Anthony, the tau. And here Anthony is bearing a tau staff. And here is a devotee of St. Anthony having a tau cross as a sign of his devotion to Anthony of Egypt. So for most people, the tau would have been the symbol of Anthony of Egypt, which is why you can still Google St. Anthony's cross and the tau will come up. And because of that, maybe the tau never really caught on as a Franciscan symbol until our own day, really, as the widespread symbol that it is. It was not the most common symbol of our movement. The crossed hands of the conformity, which, let me see. Here at the conformity, the two hands on my ring are with the tau. But that crossed hands, the conformity of Christ and Francis, was really the common symbol of a Franciscan. It may be because it was so associated with Anthony of Egypt, it never caught on until our modern day. But for Francis, probably it comes from the opening sermon, which was on November 11th in 1215 of the Fourth Lateran Council, which was a pastoral council like the Vatican Council. In other words, it wasn't a council having to do with laws and regulations, but it was a pastoral council having to do with the spiritual life of the church, especially focused on the sacrament, on the life of priests, on care for the Eucharist and devotion to the Eucharist, and the renewed sacrament of penance and reconciliation. And Francis was present and seems to have been really taken with that council and with the sermon that Innocent III preached on that opening day in 1215. And Innocent used the sign of the tau. And it would seem that Francis adopted the tau from that sermon, though its association with Anthony of Egypt, again, another association, can't be taken away. In Francis's day, it would almost have been like the Nike swoop. No matter what the Nike swoop is on, you kind of know it's Nike. And it would be hard for anybody in Francis's day to see a tau without associating it with Anthony, and even beyond Francis' day. But anyway, here is a basilica or the chapel of a medieval hospital that the Brothers of St. Anthony of Egypt had. This would have been long after Francis. And you can see, even though the tracery in this window is broken, it's just a window of towers. But the tau had other associations that Innocent in his sermon embraced, and that we would assume Francis was embracing. The staff on which Moses, here we go again, raised the brazen serpent when the people in the desert were all bitten and dying by the serpents, and God was asked by the people to help them and cure the people dying of the venom. And he told Moses to set up a brazen serpent on a staff. By tradition, the shape of that staff was a tau cross. So an association with Christ's crucifixion and the power of the cross, which Innocent referred to in his sermon. And also this, which is the association in this particular painting, the vision of Ezekiel, where there is a tau rider who will come and mark the foreheads of those who are righteous with the sign of the tau. So it became known as the tau rider. Francis will be identified with a lot of these apocalyptic figures. And the Franciscan order will be identified sometimes in the case of the Joachimists, which was a movement following a Cistercian abbot who talked about the end times and talked about people of the Spirit who would come at the end times. And many of the spiritual Franciscans saw themselves as those people of the Spirit, which is why they became known as spiritualists. So, but even Bonaventure and some of our other writers will use apocalyptic imagery for Francis, that he is the angel of the sixth seal. And in this case, he is the tau rider, the one who writes the tau. And so in this painting, and if you look at the, unfortunately, it's hard to see, but on these are two brass plaques from two different, probably gospel books, which would have been from maybe the 1100s. If you look on the foreheads, the one he's already marked, the Tao writer, you see Taos. And here you can see the word Tao cross, Tao crucis. So one of the images that the painting of Francis with that letter of Leo tucked in his cord would have been trying to get is Francis is the Tao writer who has come to mark those with the sign of righteousness, the Tao. That would have been an early Franciscan thing. And this is a tie to our last image, maybe the most radical image in this painting of Francis, which ties these two things together. So on the bottom, you have a depiction of the people in the desert. Moses has set up the bronze serpent on the staff, and you see the staff has the sign of a Tao, right? It's Tao-shaped. Someone actually gave me a Tao with a serpent wrapped around it, like a medallion, which I've rarely worn because most people, when they think I'm some kind of Satanist. But it's a beautiful image of this and one of the origins of the Tao sign from this story. But the artist here, who's a Mexican artist, actually of the 18th century, has linked this revelation of the crucifixion, in a sense, of the Tao, with the Transfiguration. And in his depiction of the Transfiguration, here you have Moses with a Tao with the serpent wrapped around it. Here you have the prophet Elijah and the transfigured Christ, and Peter, James, and John. And he has added what's known as the instruments of the Passion. So he's even connecting the Transfiguration with the Passion, but certainly connecting the Transfiguration. If I be lifted up like the serpent on the Tao, he's probably making the connection with the transfigured Christ. If I am lifted up, I will draw all things to myself. And so this kind of connection leads to the final image of this mystical Francis that we'll look at in the painting. So we've already said Francis is brighter. If you see it in person, you know that the figure of Francis is brighter than the other painting, the rest of the painting. He really sticks out. And this is one of those medieval paintings where nothing is there just for looks. They all have a meaning. So if we look next to Francis, if we look down here first, this is terrible. I actually took pictures of the actual painting when I was alone with it the last time, and I have to, this is very fuzzy, it's terrible. But this face, maybe you can tell, it's a rabbit, it's a hare, and it's hiding down here underneath Francis's hands. Which, as we're talking about his hand, you'll notice there are no marks of the stigmata on this Francis, which is a further sign that this is not a picture of Francis receiving the stigmata. But anyway, Here is this little rabbit hiding in a hole. The rabbit hiding in a rock in the Middle Ages, but the early Middle Ages. Augustine will talk about this, referring to some of the Psalms, that the rabbit, especially a rabbit hiding in the cleft in the rock, hiding in the hole, is a sign of humility. And Augustine will go on at great length about how this rabbit, this kind of a rabbit, is a symbol of our friend Moses. Moses, who felt he wasn't worthy to look on God. Moses, who, in his humility, which the rabbit is a symbol of, bore the message to the Israelite people, and thought he was not worthy. Remember his dialogue at the burning bush about, I am a stammerer, I cannot talk. Send someone else. So the rabbit, especially hidden in the rock, is a symbol of Moses. So we have the rabbit. I don't have a very good picture. Why did I do this? Down here, under his other hand, in this unfortunately cut off image I've used, is the lip of a jar. Okay. So this is the jar that's under his left hand. The jar is a symbol of Elijah. Remember that he went to the widow, and the widow said, I only have a little oil in my jug and some meal, but I'll feed you anyway. And Elijah says, you will have an abundance of oil, and the jug becomes miraculous and doesn't run out of oil. She has more than enough oil for everyone for a while, right? So the jug then becomes the symbol of Elijah. So, this is better. Here you have Moses. Here you have Elijah. Here you have someone in this bright light. It's the transfiguration. And so Francis, as we think of him, or as other people have written of him, as like another Christ, as alter Christus. So in this sign of the transfiguration, Francis, in his mystical experience and his mystical life, transformed, transfigured. The early life says, he was seen not so much as being a person of prayer as having become a prayer himself. So Francis as a sign, an image of the transfigured Christ. There's a lot more imagery in this, but I think Francis as the new Moses in his experience of the burning bush, his encounter with God, and Francis transformed and transfigured like another Christ, becoming Christ. I live, no longer I, but Christ who lives in me, I think are two of the most powerful in this lens of Francis the mystic and Francis the prophet. So I hope this has been helpful, as I always hope these things are. And I hope if you have any questions, as always, you're free to get a hold of me. And may God bless you and all of us as we try to figure out who is Francis for us. Saint, founder, prophet, friend. What is he for us?